When 61-year-old Lilia Dela Cruz sold everything she owned to marry the man of her dreams in Australia, she thought she was chasing love, until the moment she realized she had walked straight into a nightmare no one could have imagined. At 61, Lilia Dela Cruz lived a quiet and simple life in a small village outside Cebu. Her days were spent tending to her garden, chatting with neighbors, and occasionally watching local television shows to pass the time. Her children had long since moved abroad for work, sending money when they could, but contact was rare. Even surrounded by familiar faces, she often felt the heavy ache of loneliness that came with age and distance. It was during one of these long, silent evenings that she discovered an online dating site through her niece's old phone. Curious and yearning for companionship, she created a profile, unsure what she was searching for, but secretly hoping to feel alive again. Within a week, she received a message from a man named Peter, an Australian who claimed to be widowed and looking for someone kind-hearted to share his life with. His profile showed smiling photos near beaches and barbecues, a life that looked peaceful and secure. Peter's messages were gentle and filled with warmth, calling her Angel and my sweet Lilia. They spoke daily, sharing details about their lives, dreams, and favorite foods. He told her he admired her kindness and saw in her a woman who deserved happiness. Slowly, she began to trust him. His compliments filled the emptiness that had grown over the years. The excitement of receiving his messages made her forget the loneliness that once consumed her evenings. When Peter began to talk about the future, painting vivid pictures of them walking along the Australian coast and watching sunsets together, Lilia believed destiny had finally smiled on her. In her heart, it no longer felt like a distant dream, but a promise waiting to come true. She was convinced she had finally found love again. As the months passed, Lilia's bond with Peter deepened into something she believed was real love. His messages became the highlight of her days, arriving like clockwork each morning and evening. He often spoke about how lonely life in Australia had become since his wife's passing, and how meeting Lilia had given him hope again. He told her he wanted to spend his remaining years beside her, building a new life together. The thought of being cherished once more made Lilia's heart flutter with a kind of joy she hadn't felt in decades. Peter began talking about marriage, saying he wanted her to move to Australia so they could start fresh as husband and wife. Lilia hesitated at first, unsure if she could leave the home her late husband had built, the one filled with memories of her children growing up. But Peter assured her that everything would be worth it. He promised to reimburse her once she arrived, saying she should sell her things to cover her travel expenses because love required courage. The word stuck with her. Soon, she began preparing for the move. She sold her small house, her late husband's old motorcycle, and her few pieces of gold jewelry. Friends warned her to be careful, but she brushed off their concerns, convinced Peter's love was genuine. Every night, she would reread their messages, imagining their future together in the pictures he sent, his cozy home, the wide kitchen, and the peaceful garden he said would be hers to tend. When her plane ticket finally arrived by email, she felt a mixture of fear and excitement. She packed her life into 2 suitcases, said her goodbyes, and told herself that sometimes happiness required taking a risk. She believed she was flying toward her forever home. Lilia's heart pounded as the airplane lifted off from Manila, carrying her toward a life she had only imagined through photographs and messages. She sat by the window, gazing at the clouds, whispering silent prayers for a safe journey and a happy beginning. Around her, other passengers chatted and laughed, but she remained quiet, lost in her dreams of finally meeting Peter. She imagined him waiting at the airport with flowers, smiling the way he did in his pictures. The thought filled her with warmth and nervous anticipation. After hours in the air, the plane descended into Sydney, and Lilia's excitement grew. The airport was massive compared to what she had known, filled with unfamiliar signs and fast-moving crowds. She clutched her small handbag, which held her passport and printed conversations with Peter, proof, she told herself, that she was loved and expected. She texted him the moment she landed. He replied that he was running late, but had arranged for a friend to pick her up. Relief washed over her. She waited patiently in the arrivals area, watching as passengers met their loved ones with hugs and laughter. Hours passed, and her smile began to fade. Just as she considered calling him again, a tall man approached holding a cardboard sign with her name on it. He greeted her politely, saying Peter had been delayed but was excited to see her soon. Exhausted from the flight and eager to rest, Lilia followed him outside to a waiting car. The city lights blurred as they drove through busy streets that gradually gave way to quiet highways and dark, empty roads. She tried to ask where they were going, but the man simply said, "Peter's place." Though uneasy, Lilia clung to her faith in love, unaware she was being led into danger. The car journey seemed endless as Lilia watched the city lights fade into the distance. The paved streets turned into narrow, uneven roads lined with tall trees and scattered houses. A sense of unease began to grow in her chest. When they finally arrived, she looked out the window and was startled. The house before her was nothing like the one Peter had shown her in photos. Instead of a modern white home with a garden and wide windows, this one looked old and worn. Its paint was peeling, and the yard was cluttered with broken furniture and rusted tools. The man who brought her carried her luggage inside without a word. Inside, the air was thick and smelled of dust and dampness. The curtains were drawn tight, and only a dim bulb lit the room. She asked timidly where Peter was, and the man handed her a phone, saying Peter would call soon. Hours passed, but no call came. When she tried to step outside, another man appeared, telling her it wasn't safe to wander. They said Peter was sorting out documents and would come once everything was ready. Days went by, and Lilia was told not to leave the house. Her meals were brought to her by a quiet woman who avoided eye contact. Her passport and phone had been taken for safekeeping, leaving her completely isolated. Every night, she sat by the window, staring into the darkness, hoping to see headlights approaching. The people around her whispered in another language, and their cold stares made her shiver. The realization began to sink in that something was terribly wrong. The dream of love she had built so carefully was beginning to crumble into fear, and she felt trapped in a nightmare she couldn't escape. On her fifth night in the strange house, Lilia could no longer sleep. The quietness around her was heavy and unnatural, broken only by distant footsteps and the occasional creak of a door. She sat awake on the thin mattress they had given her, clutching her small rosary and praying for guidance. Through the thin walls, she began to hear muffled voices coming from the next room. She pressed her ear against the cold surface and listened carefully. What she heard made her blood run cold. The men were talking about new arrivals, documents, and buyers waiting. Her mind struggled to make sense of the words, but soon the horrifying truth began to unfold. She wasn't waiting for Peter at all. She had been brought there as part of something dark and dangerous. Her heart pounded as she realized she might be one of several victims. Panic rose in her throat, but she bit her lip to keep from crying out. She needed to stay quiet, to think, to survive. The next morning, she looked around the house with new eyes and noticed small details she hadn't before: locked rooms, barred windows, and women's belongings left behind, as if others had once been there and vanished. Every sound made her jump. The woman who brought her food refused to meet her gaze, her silence confirming everything Lilia feared. That night, she kneeled by the window and whispered prayers into the darkness, asking for strength and a chance to escape. Her trust in Peter had shattered completely. The man who had promised love had led her into a nightmare. She knew she had to find a way out before she became another name lost to the shadows of a cruel deception. The night she decided to run, the sky was dark and moonless. Lilia waited until the house grew silent, listening carefully to the rhythm of footsteps outside her door. When one of the guards stepped out to smoke, he left the door slightly open. Her heart pounded as she realized it might be her only chance. Moving slowly, she slipped her feet into her sandals, clutching her small rosary for courage. Every creak of the floorboards made her freeze. She could hear her own breathing, uneven and shallow. When she reached the doorway, she looked back one last time at the dimly lit room that had held her prisoner. Without another thought, she stepped outside and began to run. The cold night air hit her face as she moved through tall grass and uneven ground, her bare arms trembling. In the distance, she could see the faint glow of headlights along a road. She stumbled several times, scraping her knees, but fear kept her moving forward. Each sound behind her felt like footsteps chasing her. After what felt like an eternity, she reached a small gas station near the edge of the highway. The lone attendant looked shocked when he saw her, disheveled, frightened, and shaking. He offered her a chair and a blanket before calling the police. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to cry, believing she was finally safe. But when the police arrived and asked for her identification, she realized her nightmare wasn't over. Her passport, phone, and money were gone. She tried to explain what had happened, but the officers exchanged doubtful looks. To them, she was just a confused foreigner with no proof of her story. The fear she thought she'd escaped began to creep back into her heart once again. Lilia sat in a small police station, shivering under a thin blanket. The officers questioned her repeatedly, asking for details she could barely remember. Without her passport or phone, her story sounded unbelievable. One officer suggested she might have been tricked into coming illegally, while another hinted she could be hiding something. Exhausted and frightened, she kept insisting that she had come to Australia to marry a man named Peter who never appeared. Her trembling voice barely carried the weight of her words. Hours passed before a Filipino community volunteer was contacted to interpret for her. When the woman arrived and spoke to Lilia in her native language, tears filled her eyes for the first time since escaping. The volunteer listened carefully, then assured the officers that Lilia's story needed to be taken seriously. The embassy was contacted, and they confirmed her background and travel records. Slowly, the pieces began to fit together. Investigators traced the online account of Peter and discovered that his identity was fake, created with stolen photos. The messages Lilia had saved on her email became crucial evidence. Cybercrime specialists followed the digital trail, uncovering a network that targeted elderly women in Southeast Asia, luring them with promises of marriage and security. The women would be brought into Australia under false pretenses, only to have their documents taken and their freedom stripped away. Lilia's account matched reports from other missing women, all linked to the same group. Her escape had opened the door to something far bigger than anyone had imagined. What began as a love story turned out to be the thread that would unravel a sophisticated trafficking operation, and Lilia, unknowingly, had become the key to exposing it all. In the weeks that followed Lilia's rescue, investigators worked tirelessly to uncover the full scope of the trafficking operation. With her help, they retraced every step of her journey, from the messages she received online to the rural property where she was held captive. Using the details she remembered, the color of the house, the road turns, and even the sound of passing trucks, they located similar sites in nearby regions. Surveillance teams began monitoring those areas, uncovering a disturbing pattern of activity. After gathering enough evidence, police launched a coordinated series of raids. The operations took place before dawn, catching the suspects by surprise. Officers stormed multiple houses and warehouses, rescuing several women who had been kept under the same false promises as Lilia. Inside one of the properties, authorities found dozens of passports, fake visas, and electronic devices filled with fabricated dating profiles. The mastermind behind the scheme turned out to be a 38-year-old man from Melbourne, using the alias Peter. His real name was Nicholas Ward, a career scammer with a history of fraud and exploitation. He and his accomplices had targeted vulnerable women from the Philippines, Indonesia, and Thailand, tricking them with dreams of love and stability. When police confronted him, Nicholas showed no remorse, insisting he had done nothing wrong. But the evidence was overwhelming. Hundreds of emails, chat logs, and money transfers tied him directly to the victims. News of the arrests spread quickly, sparking outrage across both Australia and Southeast Asia. For Lilia, it was a bittersweet moment. Justice was being served, but the scars left behind ran deep. The world now knew the truth, yet she could not forget the days she had spent trapped, waiting for a man who never truly existed. When the court hearings began, Lilia was asked to testify about her experience. Sitting in the witness stand, she spoke softly but clearly, recounting every painful detail of how she had been deceived. Her testimony brought silence to the courtroom as she described selling everything she owned, believing she was flying toward love, only to find herself imprisoned in a stranger's house. Many in the audience wept quietly as she told her story, her voice trembling but strong. The prosecutors presented digital evidence linking Nicholas Ward and his group to multiple victims across different countries. The fake profiles, the travel arrangements, and the stolen money all pointed to a carefully planned operation built on emotional manipulation. When the verdict was read, Nicholas and his accomplices were sentenced to long prison terms. For Lilia, justice brought relief, but it could not undo what had been lost. Her savings, her home, and her sense of trust were gone. With the help of the Filipino embassy and community organizations, she returned home months later, frail and quiet, but alive. Her daughter welcomed her with open arms, weeping as she held the mother she thought she might never see again. The first weeks back were difficult. Lilia avoided her phone and refused to go online, afraid of seeing another friendly stranger's face on a screen. She spent her days tending a small garden behind her daughter's house, finding peace in the simplicity of growing flowers again. Though she had escaped the nightmare, the memories haunted her dreams. But as she looked at the young women in her neighborhood, she began to speak about her experience, warning them to be careful of those who promise love through words alone. Her pain slowly became her purpose. Lilia's story quickly spread beyond her small village. News outlets across the Philippines and Australia covered her ordeal, turning her into a symbol of resilience and warning. Reporters described how a grandmother's faith and love had uncovered one of the largest online trafficking schemes in the region. People who once dismissed her as naive began to see her as brave. Community centers invited her to speak at awareness events, where she urged others to be cautious about strangers on the internet. Her gentle voice carried both pain and strength as she shared her story, hoping it might save someone else from the same fate. Authorities used her case to improve international cooperation between cybercrime units, tracking down similar online scams across borders. New policies were introduced to protect vulnerable individuals from online exploitation, many of them inspired by Lilia's testimony. Despite her newfound recognition, she lived humbly, choosing peace over publicity. She often said she did not want fame, only for no one else to experience what she had endured. Each evening, she lit a candle by her window, praying for the women who had not escaped. Though her body carried the marks of age and trauma, her spirit remained unbroken. The loneliness that once drove her to seek love online was replaced by a sense of purpose. She found comfort in knowing that her suffering had not been in vain. In the eyes of her neighbors, she was no longer just the woman who lost everything for love. She was the one who turned tragedy into strength. Lilia's journey served as a painful reminder that not all promises made in the name of love are true, yet it also showed how courage can rise from the deepest betrayal and bring light to others lost in the dark.